But the important thing to realize, we don't consider climate change to be a problem. It's a symptom. When you have physical growth in a finite planet, pressures are going to mount to stop the growth. And climate change is one of those pressures. So it's a symptom of our efforts to keep promoting physical growth in a finite planet. Ironically, if we solved climate change, if we could somehow push a magic button and eliminate greenhouse gases anymore, then the consequences will be, but continue with our growth, we'll just have to see bigger pressures in other sectors, then water scarcity or epidemics or warfare or some other pressure will have to become even more powerful, because finally the pressures against growth have to equal the pressures in favor of growth. And only when they're equal, growth will stop. In 1972, when we published that first book, Limits to Growth, it provided a lot of data and a computer model and many scenarios, but the basic idea was that the policies existing at that time promoted exponential growth of population and material consumption. That was the first point. The second point, the Earth is finite, there are limits. And then the third point, when you have exponential growth in a finite planet, either you have to stop it yourself or it will be stopped by global problems. So those were the three things. And then we said finally, and if you're going to stop it yourself, the sooner you do that, the more possibilities will exist afterwards. When we did that forecast back in 1972, almost immediately people from the newspapers and television came and said, so how are we doing? And of course I said at that time, it needs 30 or 40 years to see whether we are right or not. So now it has been a little over 40 years. And generally, the studies which are done say that we are on the path of our standard scenario. In that 1972 book, we showed 13 different possible futures, 13 different scenarios. Some of them were overshoot and collapse, and some of them were transition to sustainability. The standard scenario, so-called standard scenario, was overshoot and collapse. That assumed no change in policies. Recently, including in a recent publication by the Dutch Environmental Ministry, it shows that we haven't made major changes, and therefore the globe is still unfolding along that path which we projected back in 1972. Globally, we're very far above sustainable levels, and we're starting now to see the symptoms of those problems which will stop growth. We said in 72, the growth is going to stop one way or another. Either we will stop it through our own actions, or the Earth will stop it. And we're starting to see symptoms that the Earth is stopping it. Climate change, water depletion, soil erosion, depletion of cheap fuels. These are examples of the pressures which are mounting against growth.
Did you expect climate change to emerge as a major sustainability issue the way it did?
Limits to Growth has been published 3 times, 3 editions. And each time, we actually rewrote the whole book. We kept the logical structure of the book. And since we were dealing with the same world, the conclusions didn't change, although, of course, as we went along, from 1972, the second report came out in 1994, and the third report came out in 2004. So, of course, as we moved along, fewer and fewer options were still available to us. Tell me your question again.
Did you think that climate change...
Oh, yeah, climate change. And those three editions reflect the changing understanding of climate change. I actually went back and looked at the three editions in English and counted the number of times the phrase climate change showed up. In the first book, once. We showed the CO2 curve going up, but we weren't concerned so much about climate change. We were using that CO2 curve to illustrate some points about what we call persistent pollution. CO2 in the atmosphere is a persistent pollutant. It lasts for a long time. And we were making some points about that. And we said sort of on the side, oh, incidentally, some people think this could cause climate change. But in 1972, there was really very little understanding and concern about it. Then once in 72, in 94, I think it shows up something like 8 times. And in 2004, it shows up, I think, 24 times. Same curve, except, of course, the points just kept going up. So we really weren't concerned about climate change in 72. And in 2004, we mentioned it but the important thing to realize, we don't consider climate change to be a problem. It's a symptom. When you have physical growth in a finite planet, pressures are going to mount to stop the growth. And climate change is one of those pressures. So it's a symptom of our efforts to keep promoting physical growth in a finite planet. Ironically, if we solved climate change, if we could somehow push a magic button and eliminate greenhouse gases anymore, then the consequences will be, but continue with our growth, we'll just have to see bigger pressures in other sectors, then water scarcity or epidemics or warfare or some other pressure will have to become even more powerful, because finally the pressures against growth have to equal the pressures in favor of growth. And only when they're equal, growth will stop. Growth is going to stop, for sure, and just a matter of what will be the pressures. And climate change is one of them.
We are also asking ourselves, aren't we still ignoring population growth as a driver to future collapse? And shouldn't there be some kind of policy here?
Well, I mentioned this morning that greenhouse gases are generated as a consequence of 4 different things: population, the level of material consumption, the amount of energy required to support that material consumption, and the fraction of that energy which comes from fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are the source of CO2. And if you look at it, all of the energy these days, the Paris conference, most of the scientific work which is being done, focuses on the last 2, on the energy intensity of our consumption and on the role of fossil fuels, trying to shift over to renewable sources. And we completely ignore population and material consumption. So yes, the answer is we ignore them. It's politically inconvenient. Politicians wouldn't want to tell you that to deal with climate change, you have to lower your standard of living. So we still have this fantasy collective fantasy that we will somehow solve climate change, but without giving up our material standard of living, and for sure not doing that politically incorrect thing to try to talk about birth rates. If you start to think about birth rates, of course, it's a very complex issue, not only because it's highly cultural specific and cultures differ from one place to another, but also it has all sorts of religious connotations. And then you get into this issue of men versus women. I mean, it's a very, very complex matter. But I know from my research that you can make great progress on this simply by trying to create circumstances where people, women mainly, can have as many kids as they want. We know, actually from fairly solid studies, that many women around the world end up having more children than they really want to have because of cultural pressures, because abortions are illegal, because of religious principles, because of cultural norms and so forth. So if we could, the first step is simply to let people do what they would really like to do.